like Microsoft 365 would be probably like a sort of a procurement purchase. And then they probably have like their own cyber, like security issues and regulation and all that stuff. And so they have to work within that ecosystem. So they're going to intrinsically force teams down everybody's throat. I mean, to use very harsh language. So even though there might be a better product out there, for example, this is a conflict that always happens in terms of like, should we use Dropbox? Should we use Slack? So I think that outcome hierarchy that's happening in terms of, procurement made decision versus what is the best product. But then I think to your point, because Microsoft now got the product in front of so many hands, they've been able to iterate and improve it. And it is pretty good, actually. To be honest, like I don't want to shit on Microsoft Teams. I mean, it's no Slack, but it's pretty cool in terms of the innovations they've done and how they've listened to user feedback. So there is merit to it, but also it's like sometimes why that is happening. Sometimes we don't even know because that decision was made not even necessarily by your boss, but like by the procurement team who's not even necessarily communicating with the people who are actually going to be using that thing.
That's one of the things which is fascinating about the current state of especially B2B products, where, usually speaking, at least till, a few years ago, the only way in which truly successful B2B products used to work was a sales-led model where you had a sales team, you talk with big enterprises and sort of convinced the buyer. And once again, the buyer is different than the user a lot of times, right? The guy or girl who's making the procurement decision is different than the person who would be using that day to day. And a lot of like shitty enterprise software that you see is so because most of the efforts are going towards getting a yes from the buyer. And what's happening or what's fascinating nowadays is the whole product-led growth or PLG, way of thinking, which is having more of a bottoms-up approach where you, like Slack, once again, let's take a look at that. I mean, there wasn't a massive sales team in the beginning, banging on the door of enterprises saying, hey, have Slack. It was essentially a bottoms-up thing where the product was so good that everyone started using Slack. And then eventually it became so much that many people convinced their organizations to use Slack organization-wide, right? And so on and so forth. The product-led growth, strategy right now is something which I think is going to be used much more in B2B, products going forward. That doesn't mean that salespeople are totally, diminished. There's going to be a role for them as well. But more and more, we are seeing in B2B products, the whole trend of product-led growth, and I think it's going to become more and more, prevalent in many of these different products as well.
I was listening to another podcast like a couple of days ago, and there's this cartoonist, a Wall Street Journal cartoonist. His name is Stu. And he sort of describes this as like the weed strategy. You know how like weed is so resilient and it can sort of grow anywhere. Mm-hmm. And once it gets to a certain point, the leadership has to take notice and be like, you know what, all our people are using this thing now, either we can kill it, use pesticides, or, encourage it and let, people sort of use what they like. And in fact, it actually works really well. In a lot of different cases, but sometimes what happens is that, let's say, for example, in a manufacturing situation, the factory manager and the people working on the machines and stuff, they have a very different interpretation experience in terms of what they need to do and how to be efficient. And necessarily the executives who are sitting hundreds of miles away don't even have a sense of like, there's no connection between those. So I think that to go and speak to the person with the pain, giving them that access and then letting that sort of percolate upwards to what you're saying, that makes actually a lot of sense. I think the fact that the buyer is not necessarily the user, the consumer is not the customer. You articulated that so beautifully.
There's also one more thing, which is like the inversion of the typical model in such a case. In a sales-led model, usually it's like, okay, should we adopt this inside the organization or not? That is the question, right? and then you have different factors, negotiation, and all those kind of things. In a product-led growth model, if it is successful, the idea isn't should we adopt this? People are already using it, so it
Right.
becomes, should we ban this and use something else? or so that's sort of an inversion of the typical model that you have in such cases. And sometimes it might make sense, and sometimes it's just too late. Everyone is already using this particular piece of software, and you can sort of make a very unpopular decision of going with something else, or you can just go with the flow and already have a bunch of work happening in that thing.
Would this be a correct assessment and sort of that it's the most democratic way, and you're giving by each user, you're creating one voting share. So that decision, when it's made, you have all the votes, and it's a complete democracy of what tool is going to be used and and that could be applied to what kind of policies and work culture and how that works comes from the bottom up.
It really depends upon the organization as well. There are some organizations which are extremely strict with their, security and privacy policies. And there's some things which, for some reason, like, for example, GDPR, you would want to make sure that you exclude some.
What is GDPR, by the way, for people listening? And even I don't know what that is, by the way.
Well, it's complicated, but it's a European sort of, it's a law from the European Union. Having some restrictions or certain directives on how you would use user data and how would you have focused software, you could say. As part of it, a lot of times, especially in European organizations, you might have that, user data needs to be served or needs to be stored on, European servers or servers located in Europe, for example. Not all organizations take that such a call, but many of them do. Things like these can really make sense to consider as well. So a lot of times you might have a successful sort of product-led growth sort of like situation inside a company, and then it becomes big enough, and then the IT team comes in and says, hey, you cannot use this because it violates this thing. Well, those things can happen, right? But those things can also happen in a sales-led model where you might be talking to a salesperson, and then for some reason or the other, the negotiations break down, and sort of like you say, hey, bye. So that can also happen, right? So I think the future is going to be product-led sales, where essentially have a product-led growth model coupled with smart salespeople who can accelerate this growth as well.
3 things that I learned from what you just said. One is the restrictions. And I think what you're talking about, if I've understood this correctly, is the scale of the organization. Because in my personal experience, for example, I work closely with large consulting firm, and they have like cybersecurity as one of their sort of service offering. So they're very strict about how each device is used because there's so much confidential data, because they're working with large banks or private and public sector. Any outside application is like a strict no. Like you can't even download those applications on those devices. There's such a strict sort of walled garden around what employees can use. And I know this because we were trying to bring in and actually this is still in flight, sort of like how to bring in this virtual tools to do, to show up differently in a virtual setting. So how do you bring in those tools into this large org? So that's an interesting learning for me as well, to go through that process and see how the decisions are made, what stakeholders get involved.
One of the points that you made was about, these big organizations which lock down everything, right? Big enterprises generally have some restrictions, right? Whether if it's a medical company, they might have things regarding HIPAA compliance and stuff like that. And your software needs to be, compliant to those things. So being compliant with regulations is always going to be a big thing for massive enterprises, but small to medium businesses, even large ones, which are not playing in those spaces, that's much better, ground for product-led growth.
So one was that compliance, meeting regulation, and sort of how do you penetrate that wall garden? And in those cases, I think you have to start with sort of the buyer first, but come in to that conversation, understanding what frontline, or the end users of that thing, what challenges they have, and then, knowing decision ladder, but also the end user, and being able to communicate that and get that conversation going. But I think in this product-led sort of growth model, I think instead of having salespeople, what you need to have is a hybrid of evangelist and sales. So you have product-led growth, but it's an evangelist meets salesperson. And now that person is coming from that right mindset because they're not thinking transactionally, but they're thinking more ecosystem and, enabling people versus I have to sell this thing and hit my targets and all that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, that's where marketing also comes in. So you have salespeople fully focused on making those sales. We have marketing, which is just generally about positioning and making sure that you just do a better job of communicating the pluses. And then you have the actual product doing a good job as well, so that the people using this are internal advocates or internal champions,
right,
for this as well, right? So for sales in general, you would need some kind of champion for you inside the organization. And with good product and the product-led growth model, you can have, more of a chance of more internal champions for adopting that inside the organization. That doesn't mean that 100% it's going to be the case that your product is going to be adopted, right? There's many other things like compliance and pricing and all those kind of things. But that gives you much more of a shot.